Chapter 11. So Familiar a Gleam. Once was a boy named Philip who dove and forgot to backflip. He landed on vines and, well, what rhymes with vines that we haven't used? Oh, times! He landed on vines 1 or 2 times, and no one has heard from him since. Briar Rose's lilting voice stabbed at Philip's aching head. He groaned, awareness and pain washing over him. Even the quiet sounds of the thorn maze, the creak of vines and rustle of leaves, hurt. He tried to turn over and gave up. Did I land on them? He asked, words scratching through his throat. Feels like I missed. He sucked in a whistling breath, or she sucked in a whistling breath. Oh, pity. I thought you might be dead. Trying to determine just how sarcastic she was being made Philip's head spin. Death can't hurt this much, he said, and forced open his eyes. The hedges towering on either side of him shifted, vines grinding the leaves to dust as if the wood and the thorns were at war. He rolled his head up and then touched his chin to his chest. That worked. So maybe he wasn't dead. He lifted his legs up and rolled his torso forward again. Slowly, he rocked into a sitting position and rested his elbows on his legs. His hands were so bruised, it looked as if he were wearing gloves. Why did my injuries carry over to the dream? Usually, the dreams were a reprieve from the physical pains of the day. After all, Briar Rose hadn't figured out how to punch him yet. But the rules had changed. He flexed his fingers and hissed. From the other side of the maze, Briar Rose made a sound like she was about to speak. How much did you hear? He asked. Philip couldn't remember what happened after the fall, and trying to recall anything only brought flashes of light and pain to mind. Enough, she said, and he could hear her swaying back and forth, clothes brushing against the grass. I cannot believe you robbed such a nice woman. She gave you a chance to leave. I'm not entirely sure of the details. Joanna and you were very close-lipped during your heist, and the guards chasing you were horrendously loud. But I overheard your fairy tutors when they got you. You jumped out of a tower, Philip. How did you even survive that? Magic, said Philip. He froze and nearly choked. Is Joanna all right? Is she safe? Briar Rose, you... He expected her to draw it out or tease him more, but she quickly said she's fine. I think. Unconsciousness doesn't really count as sleeping, apparently, because I still heard bits and pieces of Joanna talking about what happened in the real world before you joined me here. Philip sighed. Thank you. I'm not a monster, she said, and scoffed. I wouldn't not tell you. I actually like Joanna. Yeah, and if she asked you something, you'd answer, said Philip. Me? Not so much. Briar Rose laughed. He slowly stood, pleased she hadn't reverted to the titter she used with her aunts. Maybe he wasn't alone in pretending to be someone he wasn't in real life. Well, we could put to rest the question of whether we'll ever dream of the other's life again now that the maze is here, she said. He stretched his arms. What's the first thing you heard? The riddle. It was very romantic, from the sound of it, just like in all those stories with knights and quests. She laughed again, and even though it was at his expense, he didn't mind. It was funny, now that he knew no one had died. I thought you were some sort of knight. Doesn't thievery go against chivalry? I'm some sort, certainly, said Philip. You know that training I mentioned in the magic? This wizard stole a sword from the king ages ago, and I had to get it back. She hummed. Oh, that puts the riddle and guards in a new light. They weren't even guards. They were magical suits of armor with weapons worse than anything I can swing. What do you even know about knights? He asked, knowing very well that she had spent an entire year being taught heresy and all the relevant details required for courtly etiquette. Having met you? Less. With that, Philip forced himself to walk down the path before him. The maze was as inscrutable as it had ever been. Hedges thick with leaves and writhing vines covered in thorns. The deep gouge in the dirt he had made with his toe and left as a marker during the last dream was still there. But since he always stayed next to Briar Rose, he wasn't sure if either of them was making any progress. He didn't feel up to taking part in their competition tonight, though. There once was a boy named Philip, Briar Rose began again. Philip groaned. Please, no. I can't believe you're so bad at rhyming, he muttered loudly enough for her to hear. You're worse than Joanna. It wasn't much of an insult, because Joanna was quite good, even if she hadn't let him see her newer work all year. She sniffed and stomped down her path. My first 5 poems were better, but you weren't here because... Oh, what was it you were doing again? Stealing? No, improvising. She clapped twice and rolled his eyes. I can't believe you thought jumping from a tower was the best escape plan, she said. Did you forget it was a wizard's tower? What do you mean? She asked. He could practically hear her heart stopping at the thought of being wrong. Worse, he was the one calling her out. The tower was bewitched, a fact even the fairies missed, and my magic failed once we were nearly to the door. He whistled, pretending to think it over. I got to do this fun bit with a horse and a lion. You saw a lion? She sniffed, a wholly unfamiliar tone in her question. A real lion? Oh, no. The one I saw was made of flowers. Briar Rose inhaled, loudly. He could imagine her curious stare from the other side of the maze, and it made him want to continue. She sounded genuinely interested, and he wasn't sure why that pleased him so. I will tell you all about it later and describe it in as much details as you want, he said, but I really need to be in the waking world right now. Wait! Briar Rose let out a little sound like she'd gotten too close to the wall. I found this book I need to tell you about. Philip sighed. A book? Yes, she said. It's by a wizard. Awakening the Dream Within. Have you heard of it? You know I haven't. He was exhausted, hurting, and not in the mood for her pointed questions. What about it? It talks about magical dreams. Most of it's nonsense, but there's this chapter about how magic sometimes provides dreams as escapes to fairies and other magical individuals. It's the first time I've come across anything about dreams in a book. Does it mention if sleeping here would wake me up in the real world? Philip asked. It might, said Briar Rose, oblivious to his annoyance. I could check, but I'm mostly hoping this will point me in the direction of another book with more information. You started having the dreams before me. Do you remember ever having normal dreams? No, but I hear they're far easier to wake up from, Philip said, sighing. It's so curious the way this wizard talks about magic. There are a few wizards mentioned in the history books, but none of it is from the wizard's perspective. They're supposed to be all-powerful and smart. I mean, you would have to be to memorize all those spells. Briar Rose's voice trailed off, but it was still too loud for him to block out entirely. This one talks about magic like it thinks and makes decisions, and... Philip pinched the bridge of his nose, a headache forming just behind his eyes. Never studied magic before, but it must be exceptionally difficult. I'm surprised you're taking it to it. How did it work when you found out? Philip could barely think past the pounding in his head. Briar Rose, I'm sorry, but I need to wake up. I can't deal with this right now. He heard her exhale sharply. I thought you'd be at least interested in figuring out why for our entire lives we had dreamed of each other in a strange wood, she said, an edge creeping into her tone. I know what you're doing is important, but it's me. So how important could it be? he snapped, interrupting her. I know what you think of me, but I'm not gallivanting through some forest doing as I please. If I fail to learn magic, no, not just learn it, if I fail to master magic, people will die. She stomped around like a child, not getting their way. I wasn't saying it wasn't important. I'm just trying to figure out why we dream of each other and why we're in this maze. And then what? He asked. As optimistic as we were, let's be honest. There's no prize for us at the end of this. We don't get anything for figuring out why we dream of each other. I was only asking questions. The hedge responded to her, the thorns growing longer and thicker. They blotted out what little sky there was. Oh, please. He pressed a knuckle against his eye to try to ease his headache. As if your questions are innocent. You think I can't do anything. Because you never do. She scoffed and paced and smacked the vine away so hard that the hedge shook. Would you rather I say nothing? You would, wouldn't you? You could say nothing, Philip spat, and still your presence would smother me. Her tone was sharper than the thorns between them. Only you would think people being interested in your life is like pressing a pillow over your face. You said practically the same thing to your father after the tournament before you threw your life away. You're so scared to love anyone and disappoint them, like you do your father, that you don't even love yourself. No matter how self-centered you pretend to be, it's cowardice. Fury flared in Philip, hot and painful, more consuming than any other emotion he had ever felt. He covered his cry with a hand. I'm not one of your stories. I'm a person, he said, so quietly he wasn't sure she could hear. He felt small, like a bug, pinned in a shadow box. His anger was so still it unnerved him. Not a fire, but smoke. So what if I give up? So what if I don't try to live up to your impossible, naive standards? No matter what happened to me, it was never going to be good enough for my father. And I'm not going to be talked down by some girl who is prattling on about dreams when important things are happening. The final words were the only ones he shouted, and he grimaced. Of course I'm talking about it, she shrieked. The dreams are the only interesting thing to ever happen to me. Philip hesitated, furious mind barely catching what she had said. That couldn't be true. She told those animal stories after story about traveling and adventure, and she'd had dozens of tutors growing up. You have no idea what it's like, she said. These dreams are all I have. The weight of it, her idyllic life being compared to his, of her dismissing his concerns in favor of the dream, and of his panic over his escape from Barnaby's tower, crashed into his chest, and Philip turned on his heel and took off down the path that led away from the wall they shared. I'm sorry. And whatever response she shouted was lost in the cackle-like creaks of the thorny vines. Philip awoke with a start. He didn't remember falling asleep in the dream maze or being dragged away by a vine. He had been racing through the paths, growling at dead ends and avoiding Briar Rose. Based on the sound of her equally angry outbursts, no matter what path they took, they remained right next to each other, separated by only a single wall. He hated it. He hated every part of it, the maze, her words, how angry he had gotten. There now, muttered Eris, patting his shoulder. You're safe. You're well. Joanna is fine, too. What? He stared at her before remembering that his fight with Briar Rose was a dream she didn't know about. Oh, right. Sorry. I had a nightmare. Who wouldn't after a fall like that? Eris said. He was swaddled in what felt like every blanket he and Joanna had. The tent flap was open, a clear evening sky twinkling down at him. Eris sat on one of her leafy stools next to him, a damp cloth in her hands, and Joanna's bedroll was gone. Eris spotted him looking around for it, and gestured outside. The camp looked the same, but they were in a different location. A northern wind nipped at him even through the blankets. We relocated while you rested to ensure we couldn't be found, and decided that moving north, nearer to the shield, was the best plan. she said. Frank is with Joanna, and Poena is ensuring that Barnaby and Zora did not follow us. How do you feel? Like I jumped off a tower and caught myself with a bunch of plants. Philip groaned and sat up. How do I look? Worse than you feel, I hope. Frank has healed most of your injuries, though it will take time for the pain to ease. She slowly helped him into a proper sitting position, pressed the mouth of a water skin to his lips, and helped him drink his fill. What possessed you to do that? I didn't know how else to get us out with the sword, and I wasn't going to let all those enchanted objects kill Joanna, he said. He still had the full range of motion in his arms, but the muscles felt far too tight. He flexed his fingers and noticed that delicate little details that matched the hilt of the sword of truth were now embossed in his hand as if painted in midnight blue and crimson red. My magic stopped working once we got near the tower. I only noticed that I might be able to use it again on that balcony because of that brooch. And you trusted your magic to catch you, she said, staring at him with wide blue eyes. Drink this. She handed him a small bottle that smelled of honey and tasted of the bitterest, meanest flowers, and he gagged it down. That is a level of faith in magic I didn't anticipate you reaching so quickly. Or ever, said Eris. Philip's remaining fury at Briar Rose sharpened his tone. You're the one who told me to have faith. You told me that magic was about belief and said I was doing well. Stop assuming I mean the worst, Eris said, and checked the bandages on his hands. What if the brooch had been wrong? Guilt prickled over him, hot and shameful. He had assumed she simply doubted his tactics, not that she was worried for Joanna and him. Philip shook his head. You made it. Eris stilled. She drew in a shallow breath and gently took his injured hand in hers. Thank you for trusting me so deeply, she said slowly. But please take better care of yourself. I am loath to say it, but I have enjoyed teaching you, and your death would be a blow. You're the only person who's ever said that who I know means it, said Philip. Everyone else wants me safe and sound for Princess Aurora's sake, not mine. I know you're training me so I can defeat Maleficent, but you haven't made it all about her. Well, let me temper it by begging you not to die until you learn illusion magic and get the shield, Eris said with a soft chuckle. I doubt the princess wants to be a widow so quickly. I wouldn't know, he said, and it sounded bitter even to him. I'm tired of hating her all the time. Now you and the others glided in with your magic and plans, and for the first time, I don't feel like I'm drowning or being tugged along on a fishing line. Eris leaned in close and tipped his chin up so that he couldn't avoid her gaze. Philip, you cannot live your life hating things simply because others think you should do them. Curses and gifts all come to pass whether we want them to or not. The curse will come, but you are in control of your reactions and the nuances of your life. Refusing everything you've been offered is a bit like cutting off your nose because someone you dislike said it was nice looking. She flicked his nose. Philip snorted, pulling away. The comment felt too much like a reprimand from his father. That makes me feel like a piece on a chessboard. Philip wiped his face. He didn't want to be controlled at all, though what she described wasn't really control. It was like setting a course through a wood. How he got to the other side was up to him, but he would get there. There was no turning back. We are all pieces on a board. Some of us are more aware of it than others, and know how to play our parts, she said. Your education, knighthood, and betrothal were all decided by someone else. They do not have to be. You can learn to play the part you want. The part I want? The deep, aching dread eased a bit, like marrying someone else. What? Eris startled. What do you mean? Have you met someone? He hesitated. The flash of golden hair through the maze and the image of violet eyes crossed his mind, and he winced at the memory of Briar Rose's furious last words. No, he said a little too quickly. But that doesn't mean I don't want to love and be loved. Eris let out a soft, breathless sound. You've known about your betrothal since you were a child. You always knew you would not marry for love. So why should you love anyone else, much less yourself? That sounded far too much like what Briar Rose had said. Yelled. Was he so transparent? I don't love the Philip I'm supposed to be, he said. Nor do I like the person those expectations have created. He hated the argument he'd had with Briar Rose. He shouldn't have lashed out at her when he knew it wasn't her fault. His frustrations and worries with the waking world were no excuse for him to yell at her, and he had to make it up to her. She had only been trying to help. He was still angry and sad and desperate for something else, and he didn't want to be the sort of person who accomplished nothing and yelled at girls in mazes who might have been exasperating but weren't at fault. And on top of all of that, he couldn't help thinking about how similar Briar Rose and he were. They were victims of circumstances outside of their control. He might have liked Briar Rose if they had met in real life. He didn't want to be so quick to anger, and that was up to him. I messed up, he mumbled to himself. Eris's brows pinched. With what? It's a secret, said Philip, looking away. He hadn't wanted his father's advice since he was a child, but he wanted Eris's. She would know what to do, or at least be honest with him. A while ago, I met someone. Eris's eyebrows drew into a single thin line. Not like that, he said, flushing. We're not even friends. We mostly vent to each other and try to outdo the other at whatever we're doing. But we got into a fight last time we spoke. Oh, she blinked rapidly and leaned against a tree. And you do not love this mysterious not friend? He scoffed. I barely even like her, and she definitely doesn't like me. You protest a little much, she muttered. You like her enough that this fight is bothering you, though. How many friends do you have? A few. Joanna and Briar Rose were the only occupants of that list. How many have yelled at you? 2 of them, he said. Being a prince is an odd sort of isolation, but isolation nonetheless, because you exist on a level many don't, said Eris. You wouldn't kill Joanna for talking back to you, but you cannot ignore that you're in that position. I imagine the only people who have ever argued with you were your father, Joanna, and this girl. Thereabouts, Philip said, shifting uncomfortably. My father gave up on it a while ago. He has no idea what to do with you, does he? She asked. His father never tried to understand, and he had a terrible suspicion that Briar Rose's aunts were the same. He knows exactly what he wants to do with me, said Philip. Did you ever fight with your parents? Oh, that was ages ago. But yes, I tried so hard to be good for them. I did everything they asked and was always worried about whether I was good enough. Then I met my mentor. Eris sighed and smiled, the sad tilt to her mouth making Philip's heart ache. He wanted a teacher that made him reminisce like that. I hated her at first, but eventually I realized that she was the only one who never gave up on me. She understood exactly why I felt how I did, how stifled I was, how helpless. She offered me an escape and pushed me harder than I had ever been pushed, and I became the best possible version of the Eris I always wanted to be. She taught me what power I truly had. Eris offered him her hand. She handed him another tonic and tapped his chin with a finger. Chin up. Stop throwing yourself off the board and learn to play the game. Figure out what rules you can bend. That was the best lesson my teacher ever taught me, and she taught it well. There is always a rule wanting to be broken. I cannot grant you a wand and make all your troubles disappear, but I can teach you how to use your magic, how to become the Philip you want to be, how to find the love you want. I will not make you worry yourself to death over being good enough for me. Philip hid his smile with a bow of his head. He had never been allowed to make mistakes or argue or question things, but Eris's permission felt like the acknowledgement he had always wanted from his father. She wasn't dismissing him. She understood. Once all of this is done, what will you do? He asked Eris. The question startled her and made her breath catch in her throat. Oh, well, there are so many things in motion that I hadn't considered it. I'm terrible at chess and will need help learning how to play my new part. I'll probably need more training in magic, he said slowly, and then swallowed the tonic in one bitter gulp. That would be best for humans and fairies alike. She would understand what he couldn't say, that he wanted a mentor like her. To our parts and the moves we're forced to make. Eris chuckled and toasted him with a bundle of bandages. Now that we have the sword, you'll be studying illusion magic. Impress me, and I will teach you everything I know once all of this is over.